Hello and welcome back to FinTech Mix, the specialist podcast for FinTech professionals where we learn from the people who make the industry tick. I'm Nat Barker and I'm very fortunate to be joined by Asif Faruque of Thought Machine. Asif, thank you for joining us. Great to have you with us. Where are you speaking from?
Yeah, great to be here. Thank you, Nat. I'm speaking from a very empty office in Old Street, East London, where Thought Machine is based.
So that actually makes you the first guest we've had on the FinTech Mix podcast who hasn't been working from home. How long have you been back in the office?
It's a good question. So I like most people, got the news March 2020 and then started this, brave new world of working from home and watching the news. And yeah, Thought Machine was a 400-person company then, and we all packed up and left Old Street, where I am now. We went back home. I've probably been into the office maybe a handful of times since then. And I think we're still, just to get the date right, it's April now, 2021. We're still in the process of really understanding what return to work looks like. And I think that's a position most companies in the world, in the UK certainly, are facing now. Like, what's the right mix, and how do we balance working from home? And then there's the whole issue of some people are enjoying working from home as well. So, but yeah, handful of times.
Now, Asif, you're head of communications at Thought Machine, and you're going to be really earning your money today by trying to explain to me exactly what it is that Thought Machine does. As I've mentioned on the podcast before, I don't actually know that much about FinTech. We kind of wanted the podcast to be as accessible as possible. And having spent a decent bit of time sort of perusing the Thought Machine website, I would not be able to tell you what it does beyond something to do with banks. So very gently, what does Thought Machine do?
It's a good start on that. Yeah, so Thought Machine makes core banking software. So core, the word is synonymous with center, the middle, the essential, and that's what it is. Every bank in the world, which is a licensed bank and regulated bank, has a system right at the heart of it, which controls and ensures that things like customer transactions, accounts data, financial products, they're all within a system. And the really interesting thing about Thought Machine is when the business was founded, it didn't take very long to learn that the core of most banks in the world have Genesis sometime around, the 60s and 70s, as early as, which is mind-boggling now. Because when we think about technology, we would never expect to have to leaf through the history books to understand how Amazon or Amazon Web Services is made, or how Netflix is made. We don't need to go that back far in time. But when it comes to banks, you absolutely need to. You need to look at mainframe computers. You need to think about programming languages invented in the 50s. You need to think about big server rooms with big pieces of hardware. And that, to this day, is how some banks are run. So that presents a bit of a challenge, because old tech at the heart of banks makes banks inflexible. It makes them slow to innovate. It limits what they can do. And it ultimately, for you and me and for every single person in the world who has a bank account, it limits what we can experience as consumers. When was the last time you were able to log on to your online banking and quickly change the terms of your credit card or your loan? Or from your app, apply for a mortgage and get it approved, with all the steps being digital along the way? The truth is, it's not really possible. So the core is where the issue starts. When that's out of date, everything gets out of date. Thought Machine gets it up to speed, brings it into the 21st century. It's all written in modern programming languages and designed to run on the cloud, which, as a slight aside, is kind of a massive sea change in the way that banks have thought about technology, because the cloud has always considered that kind of insecure, slightly nebulous technology infrastructure. So yeah, we're pushing banks into the future with modern technology and aiming right at the heart of the bank systems.
That's very well explained. That was the term that tripped me up, actually, the core of the bank, sort of the bedrock foundation for the way that the banking system operates. Okay. I mean, that's a very ambitious concept. Do you know how the idea for Thought Machine came about? Was there a kind of a problem in the market that needed to be solved, as it were?
Yeah, it's hugely ambitious, and there's a good story. So our CEO is a former academic. He developed text-to-speech research, and then ultimately produced businesses which then sold to Google. And then kind of as things moved on, wanted to create financial products for banks, sort of advanced things. But that wasn't really within grasp because of the core, the heart of the bank. So out of date, you can't really build anything modern on top of it. You can't think of a new advanced analytics or AI or all these kinds of things. It's just not possible. So yeah, hugely ambitious. And the fact that no one had done it before is a testament to just how ambitious that is. Think of the core as this kind of interconnected organ with plenty of arteries and connections going out to various other organs in the bank, let's say. So to replace one has a huge impact on everything else. And so for a long time, people just didn't want to touch it. They didn't want to touch the core. And they just thought they'd kind of do organ transplants around the edges, to keep the analogy going. But over a certain amount of time, you need to start thinking about modernizing your core. And no one had done it really to great success prior. And so, yeah, Thought Machine started in 2014 to address that big, ambitious problem. And subsequently, as a 7-year-old business now, it's got live clients and multiple releases and is international. So, yeah, ambitious but achievable.
It seems to me there's something quite profound then, something that, the sort of work that Thought Machine's doing potentially affects quite a lot of people in quite a, in quite an important way in their day-to-day lives, the way they access the money and that sort of thing, without them having the faintest idea, really. It's quite a strange thought.
Yeah, it's one of those things. It's totally okay, I think, for Thought Machine to be a worldwide success and a multi-international company without a single consumer knowing Thought Machine's name. I think that's okay. So
yeah, I mean, do you come across numpties like me from time to time who struggle to get to grips with the kind of the notion, or am I just unusually thick?
you're not a numpty at all. I mean, when you're in FinTech, there's probably a greater chance you'll understand and have an interest in core banking, right? For everyone else on the peripheries of FinTech, I think it's best explained by saying that you can't build an impressive house with weak foundations, and we just need to address those for the good of banking as a whole. I mean, so much good comes out of modernizing the core of the bank. So much opportunity opens up, the ability to build new financial products that we'd never dreamed of in the past, to increase access to financial services, to allow banks to offer products to new groups and customer segments. Yeah, the list goes on, but it's totally cool for us as consumers to not have the faintest idea of what a core does. But actually, it's incredibly important for us to benefit from what a core does, in the sense that, I used the example before, innovation in consumer industries is just light years ahead. I mean, it's such second nature now for everyone to go to Netflix and then have just catalogs of movies and TV shows at their fingertips and be, we almost take for granted the fact that I'm on the train, I'm on the tube, and I log onto the app and I can stream a video. But there's such an incredible piece of foundational work involved in making sure that the content is there, it's streamed appropriately, there's no delays, it's reliable, and it scales so that millions and millions of people use Netflix at the same time, and that doesn't impact anything. So much infrastructure work goes into that, and that's analogous to what we're doing at Thought Machine, just improving the way that the systems run and the way that they scale and how available they are and how banks can innovate. So, yeah, hugely important.
Tell me a little bit about the company in terms of its size. How many people have you got with you now, and what sort of are you working with the high street banks that a lot of people have heard of and use?
Yeah, we are. The company size-wise, I joined January last year, and I think, if I recall, it was 200 people at the time. Okay. So I came with a 200-person company, which is a pretty good size in terms of processes and structure and things like that. It's now April 21, and the company's 530 people, I think. So, yeah, we've more than doubled in just a year's time, which is it's a kind of a roller coaster in terms of how fast things change and how quickly you need to adapt. And yeah, it's not for everyone, in the sense that you've got to think quick and act quick to work in a company that's 2 times its headcount in a year, and also opened up 3 new offices internationally. So size, it's there and it's growing as well. There's just demand for it. And to that point, yeah, in 2020 was a busy year, as we'd announced, on top of Lloyds Bank, Standard Chartered, and Atom. We then added Monese, Curve, TransferGo, and a few others to the list. So we're slowly collecting a kind of list of high quality big banks around the world who want to use our system and will implement our system. And a testament to banks like Lloyds as well. I mean, Lloyds Banking Group are massive UK financial institution. So it's a real testament to what we do, that we're working with them. That also includes banks like Standard Chartered, internationally known and recognised. We're very keen to make sure that our software goes into the hands of big, ambitious, leading banks around the world. So exciting times ahead.
Are there any trends in the banking world at the moment that you guys are seeing that you think are indicators of how we might be storing our money in the future and how that might be changing?
That's a really good question and a big question. So I won't dive into all the specifics, because finance and tech are becoming sort of exponentially broader in what we can do and what we can imagine with it. I mean, if you'd spoken to someone in 2010 about digital currencies or cryptocurrencies, people would be scratching their heads. But today it's almost, I saw an advert for Bitcoin on the bus the other day and at the train station. So things are moving in finance and tech quite rapidly. So I wouldn't want to say I have a very confident view on how people will manage their money in the future. But what I will say is this: considering the rate of change, I think the best thing one can do is just prepare for the unexpected. And that means doing the necessary prep work from both an institutional point of view, from a vendor's point of view, to ensure that whatever changes do come in the next 5 to 10 years, that the technology allows that innovation to happen. I've given a really abstract answer to the question, but what I am saying is set your technology up so that the future isn't as shocking as it could be. So think platform as opposed to product. Try to ensure that future products can be built and defined so that in the future, when we're all looking at bank accounts behind our eyelids and then we're just touching the sky to make adjustments to our loans or whatever we're doing in the year 2040, when we're in our hoverboards and applying for credit cards, I would just say find the technology that ensures that that future is within reach, and don't box yourself into what you think the future of finance will look like. I go back to crypto again. Nobody had ever imagined that potentially a cryptographically secured cash would be the way that anyone would be transacting value. But it doesn't seem so out of reach now. You've got big companies thinking about it. And then to move away from crypto, sounds silly to say this, but like phones, I think, banks of the 70s and 80s really focused on in-person banking and to some extent telephone banking. So those are the things that they'd imagined the future of finance would be centered around. Hey, let's improve our telephone system and our automated help menu so that people can phone up and check their balances or send money. And I think they had thought that banking would move in that direction. But actually then the smartphone came around and I say nobody, a huge proportion of people did not need to ring up their bank anymore or go into branches anymore. And that's a kind of sea change shift in consumer usage, which you can't plan for, because no one can predict the future very accurately. We're very bad at that as humans. But what we can do is ensure that the technology is set up to allow for some variation, or at least a little bit of variation in the way that we manage our finances. So yeah, think platform and not product is probably a piece of advice I'd give to anyone embarking on financial technology. As for how I'd like to interact with my finances, I think I would like my bank to know as much about me as possible. I think that's still an open debate, right? And that's a question of how much are you willing to give away and what are you intending to get back in return? I think that argument manifests a lot in sort of Facebook and social media. A lot of people are increasingly uncomfortable, understandably, with the way that data is being used, especially for services that you don't pay for. I sit on the side of the fence of, well, I think I know what I've given up and I know what I'm getting in return. And if those boundaries can be more clearly defined and I'm getting value out of it, I would love my future of finance to be more centered around me.
How do you think that might look for you? What's the kind of the benefits of your bank knowing as much about you as possible?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So it kind of ties into the technology question. But at the moment, when we get offered financial products, I get this sense that there's a limited range and there's a limited options of what we're offered. I think FinTech has come to fill some of those gaps because they can sense more about us. They have more access to data about us as individuals, and therefore you get products designed for joint bank accounts, people in relationships. You get bank accounts now coming to the fore, which are designed for the LGBT community. you've got bank accounts coming through for Black and ethnic minorities. And then that extends to products as well. You get credit cards which are tailored to your exact needs. You get a mortgage which could be offset against your personal financial situation. There's so much to think about, but I don't think we've even begun to scratch the surface when we talk about what a tailored financial experience actually looks like for a customer of this year and this age.
I guess for the person in the street, one facet of the nervousness that some people have around, institutions like and perhaps especially banks having a lot of information about them is security and cybersecurity, and the idea that that information might be at risk. Do you think that cyber attacks and cybersecurity is going to become an increasingly important aspect of the way that banks do business?
It's always been really, really important in the way that banks have to. They're so heavily regulated, and they have such a responsibility to protect the data of their customers and their partners. So, yeah, it's always been huge. I think it's only growing as just against the backdrop of just general cyber threats growing. I think as individuals, there is absolutely a shift in. I hope there's a shift in people being more conscious of how they interact online and how they fill in their data online, and cookies and password managers, and the list goes on. I think people are moving towards being more security conscious, which is only a good thing. And banks always have that pressure to be conscious and responsible with their data, increasingly so.
Asif, we mentioned that you are head of comms for Thought Machine. I just wondered what your priorities are as head of comms. What is it that you are kind of working on in your day-to-day basis? What are the things you're focusing on? What do you think is the key to good comms for a company like Thought Machine?
So the explanation I gave you earlier when you asked me what Thought Machine was and how to explain it, that's kind of the elementary part of what I do, in the sense that it's everything spawns out of how do we explain what we do to the people who need to know what we do. And then you get into things like segmentation and crafting a different message for someone who works in a bank, or someone who works in a fintech company, or a partner. Or the fun stuff is, when I have to craft up a campaign or an advert or do some copywriting and actually get the creative part of what we do out into the market. So it's really dependent on explanation and messaging and message optimization. When you kind of start on the bottom rung of marketing and comms, your job is really just to get the word out there, whatever it may be. It's social media, or a press release, a blog. When you kind of climb the ranks a little bit, you realize there's so much more work to be done in optimization of that message. The thing I love most about comms is that I'm obsessed with the way that companies present themselves. I'm obsessed with the way that people speak. I just find it fascinating. So whenever I sit and listen to a podcast or watch Louis Theroux or David Attenborough or whatever, I'm just always focusing on why they've chosen those words and what effect those words have had, and why they didn't choose another set of words. I think it's just fascinating. So I've got this kind of like list of speakers that I tune into, and I make sure I kind of learn from them. And I try to take some of that best practice into the job I do, and make sure that when I do communicate for Thought Machine, why am I choosing the words I do? Why have I used the word bank instead of financial institution, or whatever it may be? And it's that constant process of optimization which is key to what we do as well.
Is there anything that you try to steer away from particularly?
Yeah, I think there are attitudes you should probably avoid at all costs. I mean, things like patronization or marginalization, just kind of common sense stuff. I think rather than things I avoid, I think that's almost become second nature, because I don't know, I'm saying this from a place of having done comms for like 8 years now, but you kind of get a second nature of things you shouldn't say as a comms person. I think a really interesting example, which is still kind of it's baffling, is I don't know if you saw KFC did a post on International Women's Day, which is March 8th, and it was a campaign on social media, and I think they might have taken some adverts out. Did you ever see that?
I think I do know what you're referring to. Yeah.
Yeah, so they did a post on Twitter, and I think it said, I'm going to have to paraphrase this badly, but I think it said something like, "Women belong in the kitchen." And the point was, it was promoting a career path scheme for women chefs to work in and climb the KFC corporate ladder, I guess. it's common sense, and I don't think there's much of a debate. There's a debate to be had, of course, but there isn't much of a debate when it comes to things like that. You have taste and bad taste, and as a comms person, you get a second nature of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. I think my focus at this stage of what I do is actually more about the optimization side rather than the avoiding side, because that stuff's kind of second nature.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, it does make you wonder, with certain things like that. How many people did that get through? How many people? How many people signed that off? Agreed that that was going to be that was going to fly. It's a bit baffling, isn't it? You mentioned that you've worked in comms for 8 years now. Could you just talk about yourself a little bit in your own career and how you came to work at Thought Machine?
Yeah, of course. I studied English at university. I left and I got a job as a sales assistant in a shop for a year or a couple of years. And I thought, what am I doing? I was scratching my head. I was 22. I wasn't. I was not in the right where the place I wanted to be. And I always knew I loved writing. That's why I did English. And I always knew I loved technology. Got my first computer when I was 5. Or the family computer. So I wanted to combine those things. So I took a journalism diploma, you could call it. It's a
Mm-hmm.
quick, short course on kind of the essentials of multimedia journalism. I then just applied endlessly for just entry level roles. I remember once applying for like a cement magazine, like Cement News. I applied for a job in like automotive journalism. I would take anything just to get paid to write. And then I got a job as a copywriter slash journalist for a small agency, which is 4 of us crammed in a size of a meeting room. And I had this like old Mac computer, and my job was interviewing bus drivers and people in the pharmaceuticals industry to help write their corporate newsletters. And I was crap at writing. I was making mistakes, but it was fun. I got this huge sense of accomplishment that I wasn't working in like accounting or tax. Not to hate on accounting or tax, by the way. I mean, those are great industries if you love them.
Just wasn't your bag.
It wasn't my bag, and I kind of felt like it. People, I got the sense that people wanted it to be my bag, whether it was culture or society or family. You should probably take a desk office-based corporate job. And I was kind of unusual in my family to want to do something a bit more linguistic and creative. So yeah, I did that for a year, then got a kind of a more proper job in FinTech journalism. And I can still say to this day, I wasn't very good at that. And I can say that without kind of feeling ashamed or embarrassed. I got into an organization, and the level of writing and the level of accuracy was much higher than I was prepared for. And I tried, and I did pretty good. I was writing features and writing news, and I learned a lot about sort of how to construct sentences and articles. I then kind of shifted into a more camera-facing role. So there's like hundreds of videos of me on YouTube and the old site of me interviewing bankers, and I got flown around, and I went to conferences, and I went to different continents, and I interviewed people who are 30 years more senior than me with tons of experience. And I'm this kind of shaking 24-year-old on camera with 3 cameras and ring lights on me, and I'm asking an experienced guy about new regulation coming into Germany. And it was a weird baptism of fire in sort of presenting and having cameras on you and constructing coherent sentences. But I managed to get through that without scrapes. And then by some fortune, I just got out of journalism and was offered a role to be head of communications for Level 39, which is this fantastic world-leading startup hub in Canary Wharf, and it has hundreds of startups there. They're all kind of 39th floor of this skyscraper in Canary Wharf with these beautiful views. And I worked alongside companies like Revolut, eToro, some smaller but really impressive fintech and cybersecurity companies. And that's where I really got a sense of what comms is more than what writing is. As a journalist, you kind of have a very narrow, I had a very narrow set of responsibilities: write the news, present these pieces to camera, do some research. And it was really liberating to have kind of just, not liberating, but it was you kind of have a defined set of responsibilities. But then in comms, it's like present the brand, shape the brand, do the social media, do the website, do the content. And it was just all of a sudden, it was just like, oh my God, there's 10, 20 new things I need to learn really quickly. Did it for 5 years, loved it. And as I said before, it's just something I've become kind of a fan of now, and it's something I really spend a lot of time thinking about. And I had to join Thought Machine because they were doing something really impressive as well. So here I am.
I just wondered whether, as somebody coming from an ethnic minority background, whether you feel that has had any bearing on your experience of working in comms, and particularly comms in the fintech industry at all.
Yeah, it has. It has. I would, it'd be silly to say it hasn't. Some of those things are more material for some people than they are for other people, right? So it's a massive spectrum of how it manifests being someone in ethnic minority. For me, the experience was sometimes kind of stark. When you're kind of working in comms and fintech, there's probably an instance where you'd be maybe in a board meeting or a manager meeting, and you look around and be like, well, no one looks like me. And you'd have to, I mean, for me, I had to quickly understand and accept that that would probably be the status quo, and just generally being more of a constructive person than, say, a defeatist person. You kind of work with that, and you kind of tend to not think about it. But that's not to belittle the experiences of plenty of people who've had that work against them. To some extent, maybe it has worked against me in some instances, but I think it's for me, it's been a source of motivation rather than kind of anything that would set me back. I feel personally more motivated by the fact that I think I'm still to this day the only Bangladeshi person I've ever met working in comms. That probably says more about me and the fact that I haven't really opened up my networks enough. But having worked with 200 startups and many more stakeholders, I still to this day am one of the few people of ethnic minority or Bangladeshi minority that works in comms and works in fintech comms specifically. It's all good. I kind of think of it as it's my torch to hold, to demonstrate to plenty of people who are going to walk these steps in front of me that it can be done, that it should be done, and you shouldn't allow any expectations from society or any preconceived notions that you have about your role in society to stop you from walking that path. So if you want to develop a career in comms and you don't look like the people who you work alongside or you see in the news or you see on websites, that's all good. That just means it's your job. But it also means, seek out people if it helps that do look like you. Get their understanding of what they did and what they didn't, and how they got up there, and how they developed their career. For me, I have to admit, I think it was relatively straightforward for me. I did, and I constantly do, just aim to produce the best work I can and allow that to speak for itself. Where there may be any gaps or expectations or notions of what I should be doing or how I should be performing, I kind of allow my work to dictate that. And also, I think it's what's really important, and I try to tell everyone I meet, is exposure is so important. I mean, there's a piece of research, I'm going to remember the name at some point, but it boils our performance and our potential to be promoted into three factors: P, I, and E: performance, image, and exposure. A lot of people, when you ask them, what do you think is the most important aspect or the most important factor to you being promoted? And they'll say, well, it's performance. How good you do your work. It's how accurate it is and effective it is. But this piece of research actually reveals that exposure has a far greater bearing on how one is promoted and how successful they are in their careers. Performance actually plays a really small role. I think it's 30% performance, 10% image, so how you're presented and how you present yourself. And then the remaining is exposure, 60%. And that means getting out there. That means having a platform. That means joining podcasts like this. That means promoting yourself unashamedly. That means sharing your knowledge and your experience with the world and being an inspiration and a motivation to others. So above all else, we've all had to battle our own sort of some stigma against us. I'm sure we all have at some point, whether you're Black or Asian or some other group which is marginalized. Everyone has their own battles to face, but I think above all else, being exposed and making sure that your voice is heard is a fantastic way to remedy that and kind of break through those barriers as well.
Do you feel that the industry has any more work to do on diversity, and inclusion?
Yeah. It's like I think everyone knows that now, and I think that's so good that everyone knows that. I feel like it's definitely coming into more. Diversity and inclusion seems to be a much more regularly used phrase in boardrooms than any other time period I imagine ever come before, which I think is a good thing broadly. I think there is still work to be done about how we sort of finesse that term, what it encompasses, who it encompasses, ensuring that we don't tip scales too much in one direction than another. But yeah, I mean, broadly speaking, I think there are, of the FTSE 100, I think there may be one, maybe two C-suite level executives who are of Black or Asian minority groups. So there is so much more work to be done in having representation along many of the levels within big business and business generally. But yeah, I think we're on that track.
Just lastly, Is there anyone working in the industry who you especially admire or look up to at all?
There are, yeah, there are. There's many to name. I think for me, developing my own career, I owe a lot of gratitude to a guy who was my former boss. His name's Ben Braben, and he instilled in me sort of a lot of the skills and qualities that I kind of keep with me today, and I will aim to keep with me going forward. I think one of them is generally just being a sort of compassionate person, kind of having more taking time to understand where people are coming from when they speak, and the things that you may not know about them, I think is so important now, having spent time with Ben. And also just being sort of broad and ambitious with your goals. So no matter which rung of the ladder you're on in comms or accounting or finance or tech, doesn't matter. It's really fun to think about what you're doing if it was scaled up by 100, what that would look like and what implications that would have for the company you work for. I think it's fun and it kind of motivates you to achieve more. I think it gets people around you motivated, and it kind of gives you this sense of excitement about what you're doing actually has an impact on the world. Even if you're just punching numbers into a spreadsheet all the time, I think there's so much room to think about, well, how can we do this at scale? How can we automate it? How can we think about this differently? And Bennett is a great advocate of that. So yeah, I think him among many others, especially in journalism, some great writers that are working to this day, and I still read their articles regularly, who just absolutely sort of inspire me, and just the selection of words, the way they write, the narratives they create. So a lot of good writers as well, who I still keep an eye on. But yeah, a handful of names.
Asif, just before I let you go back to your non-podcast life, I'm going to ask you a few quick-fire questions, if that's okay. So firstly, what's your ideal day off?
Being with friends, walking by the sea, getting fresh air.
How do you travel around London? Are you a cyclist? Are you an Uber fanatic? Do you get the tube? What's your preferred mode of locomotion?
It's changed. It used to be tube, then it became bus. Now it's an Uber.
Do you have a favourite superhero? No is okay as an answer.
Yeah, no, I do, but I am struggling to remember the name. So I'm just going to allow the audience to work this one out. There was a TV show in the early 2000s, late 90s, of a guy who could stop time with a pocket watch.
Bernard's Watch. I remember that TV show.
He's my favourite superhero, but I do think superhero might be a bit of a stretch for Bernard. I guess he was, yeah, Bernard.
I guess if Batman is a superhero, then he's a kind of superhero as well. You know?
Does Batman set the bar quite low, do you think?
Batman is like he uses tech, right? He's a tech superhero. He can't fly or anything like that. So Bernard's just got a watch. What's your most used emoji?
The smiley face with the heart eyes.
Do you prefer lying on the beach or tramping across rainy mountains?
It depends on what mood I'm in. So both equally.
Do you have a favourite dessert?
Tiramisu.
Do you have any unusual phobias?
Unusual phobias? No.
And finally, would you rather be a crab or a rabbit? And please explain your answer.
I'd rather be a crab, because I think having access to both land and sea is just a no-brainer.
Asif, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of FinTech Mix.
You're absolutely welcome, Nat. Thank you for having me.
Hope you enjoyed listening to this episode. I would definitely encourage you to click subscribe if you haven't already, as there are plenty more where this came from, and we've got more great guests coming up. FinTech Mix is a podcast from Say Hello to Audio. To find out more about the podcast, visit fintechmix.com.